Let me switch gears and suggest that economists, if they can't agree on what might be an appropriate answer or way or a set of policy tools for addressing the euro, they may be able to agree on a statement of the problem. And let me offer, as economists often do, an incredibly simplistic statement of this problem. And here's the simplest one I can think of, and then I'm going to invite my distinguished colleagues to critique it, and we're going to launch our discussion. I'll ask them a few questions, and then we will ask you some questions, or you'll just gang up on us, or whatever emerges, shall we say. So here's my mental model, if you will, and this is what economists like to do. They construct toy models. Imagine for the moment you had two countries. One, we can think of a rich country or a relatively rich country, call it Germany. The other, we can call it a poorer country, relatively poorer country, Italy or Spain. And these countries come together roughly a decade ago, who's counting, and they say, why don't we form a currency union? Great. And just for the sake of discussion, the richer country tends to have more, it can set the agenda. It can be essentially the monetary authority in moving forward with this currency, which we might call the euro, or we could call it anything we want. And over the course of that decade, the two countries pursue different policies towards growth. And one happens to be, the richer country in this case, happens to be a little bit more productive over time than the poorer country. And for whatever reason, and we can discuss the reasons, the wages in the poorer country don't necessarily adjust, and we don't have an exchange rate safety valve because now they're under the same monetary union. And we have unemployment in the poorer country. So my question to you guys, if you will, to the distinguished experts, is that a reasonable zeroth order or first order statement of the problem, and what did I leave out, and how should we begin thinking about this mess? And if you agree that it's a reasonable statement of the problem, what do you do about it? Peter, you want to take a shot?
Okay, first of all, if we're going to, are we going to stick with the theoretical model, or do we want to broaden it to add any political economic reality of Europe to this?
From my point of view, it's Miller time. It's your dime.
Oh, fair enough. Well, you know, there's a long history of currency unions, and almost all of them fail. And the ones that don't fail are permanent failures anyway, that we just don't acknowledge it. But let me offer you one. You're sitting in one right now. North and South Italy. That's a currency union. It's been failing for as long as as long as there was a lira before there was a euro. Oh, is that enough for not enough for you? How about North versus South England? Another failed currency union. Or how about Catalonia versus the rest of Spain? Yet another failed currency union. Or let's go a little further. How about the United States? Now you say, oh, that looks like it works, doesn't it? Well, if you lived in West Virginia, and essentially people have been asking you to internally devalue and adjust yourself to the fixed exchange rate between West Virginia and California for the last 100 years, and yet your unemployment is still twice as high in West Virginia, et cetera, et cetera. And the only way you get by is because you've got two senators you send to Washington who send back a lot of welfare benefits. And also, if you're young and you grow up in West Virginia, you can also buy a bus ticket to Texas or California. Now, you could say, well, what are we talking about? You mean the United States shouldn't have a currency union? Not clear to me. Not clear to me. But as soon as you begin to look at this problem this way, you realize what a bizarre and heroic idea the euro was. And I think largely justified at the time, and still largely justified not on the economics of it, but on the politics of it. This was about largely at Germany's pressure to bury Germany once and for all in Europe. And that, to me, was a fine and heroic idea. But it was bucking horrendous history and reality, and economic reality. And now we're paying the piper. I'm going to shut up in 1 second, but let me point out, well, how did it last the decade or so? It lasted the decade in one of the ugliest possible ways. We had a bubble. People started loaning money to Spain, to households and banks and governments in Spain and the periphery at interest rates that did not reflect the risks associated with those loans, on the implicit assumption that somehow the risks were really lower than your brain told you, than your left brain was telling you, that there was some right brain heroic measure that made this okay suddenly. Well, we had a bubble, and now the bubble's over. Would it have been better if the bubble had ended 2 years after the formation of the euro? I don't even know, probably. In any event, I'm going to pass this on because my own sense of it is this is a very depressing situation because the politics were all right, and now we're stuck in a place where we don't know what to do, and the politics are going all wrong.
Right, Peter, you want to educate us on the politics, and then
well,
Michael,
let me just challenge Peter's. I mean, I agree 100% with the precepts you set. I disagree 100% with your conclusion. To say that the United States is a failed currency union, Britain is a failed currency union, I think gets to the core of my argument. It is 100% true to have a currency union, you need a fiscal union in which there are fiscal transfers. A wealthy person in Massachusetts pays taxes to the central government that goes to Mississippi. A wealthy person in London pays taxes that goes to Wales. Back in the Deutschmark days, a wealthy person in Bavaria pays taxes that goes to Eastern Germany. That's how fiscal unions work. And it could work in the eurozone if the same exact thing happens. This is not something that doesn't exist anymore. I mean, it's interesting to me that a lot of eurozone finance ministers have on their desk a biography of Alexander Hamilton. Exactly the same problem presented the founding fathers of the United States in the 18th century. Virginia had paid off all its debts, and the other colonies had not. And Virginia didn't want to have common debt because they didn't want to pay the debts of Georgia and other colonies. And Alexander Hamilton said, we need a central bank, and we need to have common debt issuance. And you know what? He was disagreed to by Thomas Jefferson, but Hamilton was right, and it worked. The United States is a successful currency union. In that way, I actually do believe the eurozone can be a successful currency union for that same reason. Now, the point you made about getting on a bus, though, that is where the rubber hits the road here. Because if you live in Nevada and you've had a real estate bubble and it busts, you can hop on a bus and go to North Dakota where there's a boom right now. Can a Spanish construction worker hop on a bus and go to Germany? Now, legally he can. The EU has free movement of labor within all 27, not just the 17 eurozone countries. But do you speak German? Now, the number of Spaniards in the Goethe Institute German language programs right now are at all-time highs. So you're starting to see some of that labor mobility. Could solve itself. But the point Peter made about politics is where I worry. Let me just tell you a quick anecdote before I turn it over to Michael. When I first arrived in Brussels, I got to go to one of these great events that I get to as a journalist. Off the record, I can't tell you who was there because off the record, but let's just say it was the best and the brightest. Eurozone finance ministers, member of the EC Board of Governors, all talking about how to solve the Eurozone crisis. And they went, there was about a dozen of them, went one up the other. And the last guy on the panel, who I can mention because I went to him afterwards and asked if I could quote him, was George Soros. And basically, the finance ministers and the ECB directors said the same thing, which is what I was just saying. In order to create a monetary union that works, you have to create a fiscal union. You have to create basically a European finance ministry that does some sort of fiscal transfers, that has some sort of power in Brussels that governs, like Washington governs the United States. And Soros said, I agree with you, but do it now and do it quickly because the politics of this gets harder, not easier. And what we've seen on the headlines has been the politics of the South. You look at Greece, we've seen riots in the streets of Greece, we've now seen riots in the streets of Madrid. That's actually not what I'm worried about. What I'm worried about is the politics of the North. And I told Jan Sebastian I was going to pick him out because he's Dutch. But the Finns, the Dutch, and the Germans, these are the three remaining AAAs that are basically financing this whole thing. We've seen last year in Finland, a party advocating no more bailouts became within a whisker becoming the largest party in Finland, 20% of the vote, in a country where 25% is where the Prime Minister's party comes from. I want to just one rant about the Netherlands because I think this is, I was saying to Jan Sebastian that I call the Netherlands the California of Europe. It is the place where everything starts and then moves. Spinoza, the Enlightenment, started in the Netherlands. As Jan Sebastian pointed out the other day, the stock market, the stock market started in the Netherlands. Everything that starts in Europe starts in the Netherlands. We will have an election next month, in the Netherlands, where right now the #1 party in the Netherlands, let me just point out that the Netherlands is a founding member of the EU, a founding member of NATO, a founding member of the eurozone. It is as core to core Europe as it gets. Next month, we'll have an election in the Netherlands where the #1 party in the polls right now is the far left socialists who are basically against the euro. The #3 party in the Netherlands is the far right party that is against the euro. And the party #2 is Jan Sebastian's VVD party, the liberals in a European sense, little L liberal, which basically means low taxes, free market, who has a campaign poster out last week that showed a Spanish football player and an Italian football player who beat the Netherlands in the last European Championship series a couple months ago in Poland. And it says they can have their cup, they can't have our credit rating. This is the party of the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, as core as you get to Europe. If the Dutch have decided they no longer want to play this game, we're in trouble. So my argument is, I actually think it is solvable. I think currency unions can work. The question is, we've been waiting to try to find the solution for 2 years. Have the politics gotten so bad that it no longer is politically feasible to do it?
Well, we see our class of students or student advisors or whatever telling us there's a 50% chance that somebody's going to announce their intention to leave the euro within a year plus.
I disagree.
Well, if you disagree, you can get onto Intrade and bet on it. But I guess the question is, if that's a significant possibility, how would you deal with that, and what would your prescription look like?
Well, the reason I think it is not a possibility is because I think actually people have looked at this, and they looked at the math, and the math of that happening is so catastrophic that they've stepped back from the edge. And it's happened twice. If you remember the first iteration of the second Greek bailout, which was back in October, they announced it was going to be 130 billion. We will now take Greece up another 3 years. And it had been solved. The markets react very favorably. And then George Papandreou, the Prime Minister, goes back and says, you know what, I'm going to have a referendum on this. And the market said, oh my God, and went nuts. Everyone in Brussels and in Berlin went and ran it up and said, you know what, we're sick of the Greeks. Just let them go. Let them have their damn referendum and let them go. But what happens when you start running the numbers is this. It's all very well and good to look at your spreadsheet and say, well, what's the exposure of my bank to Greek debt? What's the exposure of my economy? It's a little country on the outskirts of Europe. It doesn't really matter. But think about it psychologically, which I think it's a problem in Germany because German finance ministry tends to be academic economists and lawyers and not market practitioners like we had, I don't know if anywhere, Michael's presentation at the Fed, at the Treasury at the time of the US crisis. They ran the numbers and the markets would say this. If I'm Greek and I have my euro in a Greek bank account and suddenly they turn it into drachmas overnight, what do you do if you have a euro in an Italian bank account? You start thinking, oh my God, they can turn my euro into a lira, or my euro into a peseta, or frankly, I live in Belgium, into a Belgian franc. I pull all that money out tomorrow and put it into Deutsche Bank. That is the collapse of the entire European banking system. That is Lehman Brothers on steroids. That is a global depression like we haven't seen since 2007. And everyone ran those numbers and said, Jesus, what's the big Greek debt? It's 350 billion euros. Pay them forever. Let them stay. We will force them to reform and try to get them to change over several years, but that letting anyone exit turns this from a currency union to a fixed exchange rate mechanism. And Sylvia's chart the other night on what the gold standard looks like is what you think of when you look at a fixed currency system. It doesn't work. And so for that reason, I think politicians in Europe realize it's too expensive. It's expensive to keep Greece in, but too expensive to kick Greece out.